Welcome to the explainer. So, when you see someone wearing noise-canceling headphones in a completely quiet room and you kind of wonder why? Well, today we're breaking down a fascinating new working paper that is going to completely reframe how we understand autistic sensory regulation. For decades, we've basically had one main strategy for dealing with sensory differences. But what if we've been looking at the solution backwards this entire time? Okay, let's just dive right into this because it sounds totally paradoxical at first, right? If someone is getting overwhelmed by sensory input, conventional wisdom says, hey, just turn down the volume of the world. But today, we're exploring why stripping away noise actually isn't always the optimal answer, and why, for some people, adding a very specific type of sound is literally the key to thriving. Here's a quick roadmap for today's explainer. We'll hit the limits of silence, introducing the predictive anchor, the perfect stimulus parameters, how the anchor works, background referent versus flow, and finally, changing how we accommodate. All right, part 1, the limits of silence. To get this, we really need to understand the dominant clinical picture of sensory overload, and more importantly, why it sometimes totally fails. The prevailing clinical model basically treats sensory processing like a bucket overflowing with water. The obvious fix? Stop pouring water in. You dim the lights, you find a quiet room, you remove the input. That's the subtraction model. But this paper highlights a specific situation where the addition model, meaning adding a continuous, often loud, but predictable sound, is actually the required precondition for a person to even tolerate an environment. The authors make a brilliant point here. They argue that if adding input helps, well, then the problem was never the quantity of the input, but the organization of it. When you strip away all environmental signals, the brain's sorting apparatus desperately searches for something, literally anything, to organize around. And that makes absolute silence exhausting. It's exactly like trying to fall asleep, but you're hyperfixating on a dripping tap, just because it's the only data point available to your brain. Which brings us to part 2, introducing the predictive anchor. So if absolute silence actually leaves the brain anxiously searching for structure, what's the alternative? The paper proposes a construct called PACER, Predictive Anchoring via Cyclic Entrainment Regulation. Now, it's really vital to understand we aren't just talking about putting on a fun Spotify playlist to distract yourself. No, this is about deploying a highly specific auditory tool to act as a stabilizing perceptual condition. The source text really lays down a firm foundation for how this anchor operates, and it is completely different from traditional therapies. This isn't a timed 30-minute clinical session. It is a self-administered, self-selected standing condition. It essentially creates an environment of maximal predictability for the brain to grab onto, functioning as an anchor in a chaotic sensory sea. Moving on to part 3, the perfect stimulus parameters. Let's look at the specific traits this sound has to have to actually work, because as it turns out, not just any sound will do the trick. The paper outlines 4 defining parameters. First, it's got to be isochronic, meaning a completely uniform, totally predictable beat. Second, it has to be self-selected, chosen and finely tuned by the individual using it. Third, it has to be a standing condition that runs indefinitely in the background. And crucially, number 4, it must have a low semantic load. That means no lyrics and no complex narrative arcs. Why? Because lyrics demand cognitive processing. They force the brain to follow a story, which directly competes for the exact same mental bandwidth we are trying to free up. These 4 things are what separate this entire theory from just simple distraction or masking. To really ground this, the paper looks at a case study of someone they call participant A. And for participant A, the absolute optimal tempo sits right at 112 to 113 beats per minute. Why that specific number? Well, it mimics a brisk walking cadence. It's fast enough to hold the brain's attention and support rhythmic entrainment, but it's slow enough that it won't accidentally spike arousal and cause anxiety. It's the sweet spot. The absolute most crucial point here is that this rhythm is consulted rather than actively listened to. It acts as a never-varying reference point. The user isn't engaging with the emotional arc of a beautiful song. They're utilizing it as an unfailing, predictable metronome to structure their reality, literally functioning less like listening to music and way more like running a clock. Okay, part 4, how the anchor works. So how exactly does a ticking clock calm a hypervigilant brain across multiple, totally different sensory channels? The authors propose 3 functions. First, it supplies a sorting frame. Unpredictable input now lands against a perfectly predictable grid, shifting the brain from absolute panic mode into relational evaluation. Second, it occupies mental bandwidth, tying up those excess resources so internal chaotic thoughts just can't take over. And third, it gives the brain's hypervigilant scanning a safe, resolving target. Instead of endlessly searching a quiet room for threats, the brain scan is repeatedly allowed to succeed. This concept right here, zero volatility, is the absolute magic ingredient. By continuously confirming this auditory prediction without fail, which is roughly twice a second at 112 beats per minute, the brain is getting continuous positive evidence of stability. And because of that, the brain's overall estimate of threat and volatility drops significantly. It is the neurological equivalent of holding onto a rock-solid handrail on a violently rocking ship. And the text details this fascinating anchor transfer mechanism. By holding just one sensory channel, in this case hearing, at demonstrable zero volatility, it actually makes uncertainty in all the other channels way cheaper to process. You anchor the hearing, and suddenly visual or tactile chaos isn't nearly as threatening because the brain's overarching threat alarm has been fundamentally recalibrated.
Section 5. Background referent versus phone.
The paper also draws a really critical distinction between two different ways a user engages with this anchor. On one hand, you have the background regime. This is where the anchor just runs quietly alongside daily life. It's a referent consulted at a very low mental cost while you work or study. But contrast that with the flow regime. This is a state of complete, thought-free absorption, like getting entirely lost in dancing to a heavy beat, where deliberative thought just completely vanishes. And there's a very distinct trade-off between these two regimes. While the flow regime offers much stronger sensory regulation and the absolute suppression of intrusive thoughts, well, it consumes all your available mental capacity, making other tasks basically impossible. The background regime, on the other hand, offers moderate regulation, but leaves your task availability super high. It's this incredible mechanism of self-regulation that adapts perfectly to what the individual needs in that exact moment.
Finally, Section 6, changing how we accommodate.
So what does all of this actually mean for clinical practice, or how we design everyday accommodations in schools and workplaces? Well, this research radically shifts the paradigm away from treating the anchor as a mere preference or a behavioral reward. In a lot of settings, wearing headphones is seen as a treat that can be conditionally withdrawn or faded out to build up tolerance to a noisy room. The paper strongly warns against doing this. The authors argue we need to view these predictive anchors as permanent infrastructure. I mean, think about it. No one proposes taking away someone's prescription glasses just to build up their visual tolerance, right? That's ridiculous. We instantly recognize glasses as a structural necessity. We absolutely must view these self-selected, structured auditory anchors with the exact same level of respect and necessity. Taking them away removes organizational capacity from a system that fundamentally relies on it. So next time you see someone wearing headphones in a bustling room, or even a totally quiet one, you have to ask yourself, are they shutting the world out, or are they actually building a frame so they can let it in? That wraps up our explainer for today. Keep observing, keep questioning, and I'll catch you next time.